Hey everyone, I'm Corey, and in today's video, the topic is combat. So, as usual, we are on pantheonmmo.com/game, and I've just been going through this in each of my videos. So today I want to talk about a couple things about combat. So let me pull out my bullet points here, my numbered points. There's a couple of things I've seen around, and I just want to give my thoughts on those. So, as usual, I'm going to start off by reading these points that they just have on their game page, right? Earn your glory. No hand holding, no easy mode. The greater the risk, the greater the reward. Bring friends, you'll need them. And strategize. Running through a dungeon isn't a matter of 5 minutes, and some area effect spells. Encounters take thought, strategy, and teamwork. Know your role and pray your allies do too. Now, I really like this because it does, and let's bring up those bullet points again. The first point I have is combat pace. Slow is not equal to boring. So a lot of things, I think this is kind of a generalized it's like when people, especially people who haven't played MMOs, just in general, kind of go and look at MMOs, like it feels, I think it is boring to watch most of the time. And I think that's just, there's a disconnect between people who kind of know what they're looking at and people who don't, right? So you're looking at an MMO, and it's kind of like I could see how you'd feel like, well, I don't really know what's going on, compared to like a first person shooter, right, where it's very clear, like you really, it's more, how do I want to say this, like visceral. It's like you're a guy, you have a gun, and you're shooting other people, and you kind of, that's more easy to digest what is going on and what you're seeing, compared to something like an MMO where you don't know the ins and outs of the combat. You don't realize, it's not immediately apparent kind of what's going on, especially if you don't know what you're looking at. But at the same time, I want to talk about combat pace, because a lot of people look at a game like Pantheon, and they're like, and they've had some combat videos and stuff, and a lot of people, I think their initial reaction is like, man, that looks slow, it's boring, right? Like, you need to change the pace or whatever. But I think, and then the rebuttal to that is slowing down the pace makes it more strategic, more tactical, and then there's kind of this back and forth. But I want to kind of dive into kind of what Pantheon is doing to actually make combat more engaging, and what it means when people just say it has more depth, has more strategy, and it's more tactical, right? So I want to talk about combat tactics, traits, and dispositions. So combat tactics in Pantheon is kind of, they had a showcase where they were talking about, and they were showing off kind of like how the NPCs are going to act or react in combat, or how they're kind of going to play. And I think that in Pantheon, this is a really key point into making the slower pace of the combat less boring, because it is boring to just sit there and like attack. Like, if that's all it is, like you have like a 3-second delay between your attacks or whatever, then that is slow and that is boring. But it's when they add things like they're like, when the systems they're adding that will actually engage people in the combat, right? Through their tactics, traits, dispositions. So to dive a little deeper into that, combat tactics are like, imagine I mean, they're all tied together in a way because dispositions also ties into this a little bit. But basically, the way it's going to work is that you have like, well, let's just do an example, right? Kind of an example of how this could work. So imagine there's a group of goblins in a cave, and in the past, like, dwarves have gone through and wiped out, a lot of the goblins in the cave, and the goblins retreat and, set up elsewhere. But then those goblins, like, start, like, hating dwarves, basically. They're like, oh, we hate dwarves. And so if you're a dwarf in your group, and you're going through and you come across this specific pack of goblins, right, or faction of goblins or whatever, and they just, in their AI, the developers have set up a way to basically be like, okay, like as an NPC monster, I can look around the group and decide, oh, there's a dwarf in the group. I hate dwarves because of this previous stuff that's happened. I'm going to attack the dwarf first, and like anyone else can't get aggro or something like that. Like just little things like that. Like that's just one example of how they could use the system, right? But they have it set up to where they can like target, the NPCs are going to be smart enough to target like the healers, or they can go as deep as they want. They can be like, okay, if you are a mana user and you're casting a defensive spell, I'm going to turn to you and interrupt it, right? I think that one was actually showcased of like the monster turned and like stunned the healer as they were casting a heal, right? So, which just adds a lot of depth and strategy that they're talking about. And then it goes deeper with traits, but that's kind of more the tactics. The dispositions, I think, are kind of like, I think of them as, they're kind of like tags on the monsters almost. Like, oh, like you have your normal wolf pack, but then one of them could spawn as like a bloodthirsty wolf. And bloodthirsty wolves, so it's like instead of like cold wolf, it's like bloodthirsty cold wolf, right? And they can go over and because they are of the bloodthirsty disposition, the way their attacks are and the way their AI kind of controls them is different. They could have one that's like, oh, this is a like frenzied cold wolf, right? And maybe a frenzied cold wolf, instead of targeting just like whoever has aggro or the tank or whoever has the highest threat, maybe because it's frenzied, like every 3 to 5 seconds or 5 to 10 seconds or whatever they made it, maybe it will change targets based on like it could randomize like all the threat levels and then just choose random target every 5 seconds and then just go around the group or just randomly just switch targets, right? So it's harder for, it just changes up the combat pace and like just different things. I'm not saying that's in the game or anything. Obviously, that's just an example of how I see that this system could be used. I think it'd be really cool to have a monster just be like, it goes frenzied and then you can't get aggro on it really, and it just goes around the group randomly. Like it would just make combat like crazy. Like it's a slower pace, but it allows for things. It allows for you to get into this kind of like, once you're in the groove, you're like, okay, I see what the monster is doing. Now I have abilities that I can use reactively because the combat is at a pace where I can kind of see what's going on and react to it, rather than just having to, smash my face all over my keyboard to press all my buttons all at the same time. Just to make sure I'm doing the most damage, right? You can make more meaningful decisions, such as I think when they were shown off in a video I watched a while ago, or I watched the video like last week, but it was from a couple years ago, I think. Anyway, they had the warrior, and he had this ability called like shield block, but it only lasted for like 2 seconds, and so you wanted to time it to where the enemy is like charging up a big attack or doing like tons of damage, like just the different windows of when major amounts of damage is being taken, so that you can be like, oh, he's, you know, I can see him. I don't know if charging was in back in that video, but they have a, like with the monk added, they have the ability to like charge up their skills. So it takes like, oh, if I charge up this for, you know, the full 3 seconds, or I don't know how long it's going to be, and then hey, it's going to do like tons of damage. And so they can have enemies do that. And so if you're a warrior and you see an enemy like charging up a big ability, you can be like, oh, I'm going to press shield block, and then it's going to hit. It's going to, you know, disperse a lot of that physical damage, and it just really allows for more strategic. Keep saying strategic, and it really is. You're able to react to kind of what's going on in combat rather than having it just be a face roll. And I think that's really, I think a lot of MMOs have moved away from that into something I call it action RPG syndrome, ARPG syndrome. That's just a term I use. I don't. It's just a lot of these other MMOs, especially theme park ones, like to just you go into the dungeon, you're running around, and you're like, you just gather up hordes and hordes of monsters. Oh, my things are falling off. Gather up hordes and hordes of monsters, and then you just AoE them down, right? And then it's just all the same, and it gets boring. And eventually, after you do it, you know, 100 times, then it's just like, well, it gets monotonous because you've done it 100 times already. Like nothing's changing about it. And with their dispositions and traits, I haven't even talked about traits yet, but with the dispositions and having them randomly spawn on monsters, so you're not going into the same dungeon and having the exact same experience every time, which really helps. Hopefully that stays. It really helps with replayability, just because of the random nature of like the dispositions in a monster. You could be fighting a monster on one playthrough that is bloodthirsty, and then you could be fighting, you know, later on. Like you kill that monster and you wait for respawn, and it could spawn as like a normal monster, or it could spawn as like a frenzied monster, like the example I was using earlier. I don't know if that's even a thing in the game, but it just adds a lot of, I think, replayability, which I think is going to be different than what we're used to, because, and the key will start to be understanding how do the different dispositions work and how to work around them. And that's just, you know, another layer of the depth of the game, of something that, you know, it just makes the game more meaningful, I think. Oh, traits. I still haven't even talked about traits. So traits are kind of like I think of them as like racial abilities, like, because as a character you get like your racial abilities, and those are like innate things that you get just for being, you know, a human. I don't even know. In fact, they might have it on the game. Let's go to races real quick. Let's just go to humans. Like, okay, yeah, let's look at this. Like shield specialization, right? Or a people inspired increases melee range and spell haste by 2%. Like you get that just for being a human. Like these kind of like passive things. Now, so traits are a lot like this, right? Where monsters have these traits on them that they get just because they're like that type of monster. And I think the example they showed was like this fire imp, and the wizard was like casting these fireballs at it, or just nuking it with fire. And the trait on the fire imp was like, I don't know if it made it immortal, or immune, I mean, to fire damage. But it was like when this creature takes fire damage, it empowers it. And the wizard was just casting all these fire spells on it, and it just got so empowered that it went and like one or two shot like the whole group, and it was a group wipe. So it's gonna be something that is gonna be like, okay, I gotta learn, to kind of slow down and click on the monsters and like read like what traits they have on them, because I could end up casting fireballs at a fire imp and having it empowered up times 100 or whatever it is, and it's just going around and killing everybody. So that, along with let's go ahead and pull that back up. So even at a slower pace of combat, there's going to be so much that you're actually engaging with. And this goes into even like how the monsters are, how the designers have like, designed the encounters and how the monsters are spaced out. And it even goes into things like maybe in some areas there are monsters in the same area that don't really like each other. And I think, I mean, that just adds a lot. Like it's kind of almost like a whoa. You go into a dungeon and you're going through and you're killing like the goblins. Let's go back to the goblins. You're killing goblins. And then suddenly you get to a room where you see goblins fighting like orcs or something. Like I don't even know. You just see these two other groups of things fighting, and it's just like, wait. So it just gives it like, it's like, wait, those are fighting. There's goblins fighting orcs, and then there's orcs down in here, and there's all this stuff, and it just is really more in depth than what it seems, and I think that's important. And I think the slower pace complements this style of game extremely well, because being able to have those interactions where you can react, you can throw up your shield block and block a huge attack, and you can just make these choices that really affect the outcome of the battle, and that really help your group and what you're doing. Another thing I wanted to talk about, I didn't write it down here, but I guess it goes back to combat tactics, actually. It feeds into this. I forgot to mention it. But something else that's really cool about the NPCs is that they're smarter than just being like, okay, you have the most aggro on my threat meter, and I'm attacking you, right? Like I was saying, they can look around and be like, oh, you're a dwarf, I hate dwarves, I'm gonna just attack you because I have bad, I hate dwarves. I mean, that's pretty racist, but the point is the same, where it's just like, oh man, I hate dwarves, I'm gonna attack dwarves and only dwarves until there's no dwarves left, because of what has happened in the lore in the past, and just the faction, like maybe like your faction is at war with their faction, and that's just how it goes. And that's totally fine. In fact, I think that's really awesome. It's just another layer of depth in the game that isn't really present in a lot of games. So at least it's not present in a noticeable fashion, if it is. So I think it's really cool to have that sort of. It's cool when the lore of the game and the backstories of the races and the characters are actually noticeable and relevant, I guess, in the gameplay itself. So I think that's really cool. But the point I wanted to get to with the NPCs also is that they're also smart enough. Like, if you're an enchanter and you mesmerize, you're like getting your group set up and you're like, okay, we need to, stun this monster and mesmerize that monster, and so we can just take this guy out by himself. And if that guy is like, might have the ability to like during the fight, he can kind of look around and see that, oh, my friend is mesmerized, I'm going to purge that effect. So all of a sudden, not only are the monsters just attacking you and paying attention to like what you're doing, they can also look around for allies, for other NPCs who are like CC'd or who are hurt, and they can heal him. But it's more than that, because it's like, okay, my guy's mesmerized, I'm going to get him out of that, and then after I get him out of that, I think there was an example where somebody was stunned, or maybe he was mezzed, and the monster got his friend out of mez and then debuffed all of the hots or all of like the beneficial effects on the player. I think that was the example. Where it's like, okay, I'm going to get you out of mez and I'm going to just get rid of all of your, then I'm going to turn to the player and get rid of all their like beneficial magic effects or something like that. And it was just really cool. It was like, whoa, that was, smart. So I think that that's going to be really, really cool. Anyway, there's so much to talk about with combat, and the discussion really can go on, because so back to the slow is not equal to boring. It really depends on the engagement of their systems. How engaging is it? How does the combat feel when you're playing it and you're having to think about all these different things, and suddenly the monster like purges the mez off of his friend, and then that monster comes into the fight, and then you're like, oh crap, now we have to deal with this. Like, do we re-mez him again, or are we fighting him? Do we have the other guy down enough where we can afford to have some DPS turn on to this guy? How are we going to deal with this situation? Oh no, the monster got low enough health, it's running away, and it went and it beckoned its friends, and now its friends are coming, and how are we going to deal with that? And it just like increases the how invested you are like in your character. And this goes back to the whole how much should dying mean in the game? Like, what is the death penalty? Like, if I die, do I just resurrect up right where I am and keep on going like nothing happened? Or do I drop everything on my gravestone and I have to run back from a point to go and get my items back? Or do I have to... There's all sorts of ways to really penalize death to the point where you're not dying just to... I know in some games in the past, you can die to get further, to just like, you can kind of just corpse run to like get into places where you really shouldn't be or whatever, because dying doesn't really mean anything, and you can actually use it as a mode of travel because you're dead and your spirit is on a safe screen. So, and then that just makes it feel really gamey, I guess, rather than you're actually this character, in this world. So yeah, there's so much to talk about with combat. There's a lot more than I talked about here. But I think it's a really good start, and they're aware that by slowing down the pace, they're aware of having to have more meaningful engagements, and I'm really excited that it's not just a group 'em up, like I talked about with action RPG syndrome. It's not just a group 'em up, AoE them all down, and then group up the whole next pack, AoE them down with the same abilities. and rinse and repeat, right? That's what I mean by action RPG syndrome, is just that, like, we want to go fast, we want to just AoE all these monsters down, and we just want to make you feel really powerful. But when you're going, group up your monsters, blizzard them all down, go to the next pack, group them all up, blizzard them down, go to the next pack, group them up, blizzard them all down. Like, that's a lot, especially after the, oh, cool, new, I feel strong, wears off, and you're doing it for like the thousandth hundredth time. When you're doing it after 100 times, it just is like, okay, you eventually kind of zone out. What I do is I put on my headset, turn up the music, and it just becomes like a grind fest rather than an interesting combat exchange, right? So anyway, I think that's going to be it for this video. It's a bit longer than the other ones. There's a lot to talk about, and there's probably a lot more that I could have broken down into. But yeah, that's my thoughts on combat. I'm really happy with the pace, and I'm really happy with the levels of engagement that we are going to be having in the encounters. And I'm really looking forward to combat and just the game in general. So yeah. Anyways, I am trying out I dusted off and took my desk mic out of the closet. So let me know how that is. If it's too much, I can do something else. I got a comment saying that my audio was a little low. Hopefully this was a bit better. But if it was too much, just let me know. And yeah, have a good one, everyone. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.